Hello, folks. Good morning, and welcome to your last YouTube lecture of the semester. Cheers. I can't say this semester has been the easiest we've ever faced, and I can't say that I would like to do Corona again, but I can say that I am super proud of you guys for making it through. And, you know, if you're hearing me, then you're watching this YouTube lecture, which means you've been trying. So congratulations on that. And yeah, we're getting to the end, okay? I feel almost like this has become a weird kind of Corona blog rather than a history lesson, but it's basically just me talking about all the things that I love to talk about. So that's where we are. That's what we're doing. I am excited about this class. I love this era called Reconstruction. It's fascinating to me. The reason that people sort of make this the dividing line between History 105 and History 106 is because the Civil War so profoundly shaped everything prior to it. Well, that's not how time works, but you can understand how the Civil War was going to happen, right? It's the culmination of all of these tensions. But then after war is over, the nation is still faced with those tensions, and it still has to deal with it, and you still have controversies. And basically the war, it created this moment when society could radically change. Like, you just had a war about this. You could now say, all right, it's time to integrate Black people into the Union. This is how we do that. And you could get shit done, right? It was this moment that there were all of these ridiculous, heady possibilities. And people were really excited about them and also really terrified of them and also completely unsure about how to grab those opportunities. And what happened was that while Washington, D.C. could do so much, while they could say, okay, well, we need to reconstruct and we're going to make this policy and this policy and this policy, they couldn't do everything. In reality, a lot of what happened in the post-war period happened because of people on the ground. So today we're not going to talk about Washington as much. Washington matters because the policies that they made mattered very much on the ground. But in our last class, we talked primarily about those decisions in Washington, D.C. Now we're going to talk about how individual people on the ground dealt with those decisions. And if you look at this image down here, I don't just mean Black people. I mean Black people and white people on both sides of this coin, and the federal employees that were put in a situation where they were forced to navigate that relationship. So you see here multiple parties, multiple kinds of power, multiple kinds of action, many of them legal, many of them not legal, many of them sanctioned by the federal government, many of them not sanctioned by the federal government. And so we just have a really interesting time when the realities of the post-war period, the fact that like Texas is huge and there's no way to govern it, the fact that like the South was economically devastated, like there were logistical things that made this story what it is. Okay, with no further ado, I am sorry, I will stop my pre-lecture rambling and actually get into the meat of the material. Oh, look, one last time, not change the first slide. Lovely. I'm not bitter. It's fine. Okay, things that you need to be thinking about. Why coffee is amazing. Okay. What social problems needed to be solved in the wake of war? So if we talk about political problems and social problems, they're not always completely opposite. But political problems being, how do we deal with the government of the South? How do we deal with making sure that people are voting? How do we, those issues we already talked about, right? But you also have a lot of problems that cannot just be solved politically. Problems, well, that we'll talk about, because I don't want to tell you because that's your discussion post. How did Black and white visions of Reconstruction differ? How did white people on the ground want to see Reconstruction be enacted differently? How did Black people want to see it be enacted? And that doesn't necessarily mean white racist people. Like, how did sympathetic white people imagine a post-war world? And how did Black people do it differently? How did the post-war period open up opportunities for Black political participation? People to actually vote, sure, but women couldn't vote. Many Black men couldn't vote because of literacy requirements and things like that. So what other kinds of political opportunities were there other than voting, and who took advantage of them? This is sort of what I was talking about on the introduction side, but what is bottom-up politics and what is top-down politics? And I focus on this in a couple of other moments in this class, but it's one of the things that I want you to be thinking about, and it's one of the things that if you take 106, I would also, which is the second half of U.S. history, I would also emphasize, which is that Washington, D.C. and like federal governments are what we often talk about, but they have a limited amount of power to do things, right? The federal government has a lot of power, but logistically speaking, they don't have that much reach. People are also doing things on the ground. So it's top-down and bottom-up politics that actually somewhere in this vague middle enact change in the world. So how do those two things interact? Reconstruction is a great way to see that, especially because I've separated these lectures and we've talked about top-down politics in the last one, and now we'll talk about bottom-up. It's almost like I'm trying to teach you or some shit. It's incredible. How did white people respond to black activism and political participation? And here I should clarify that I do mean white racist people. So how did white people in the South that did not want to see these kinds of changes, how did they react? What did they do? How did they try to stop these changes? That's the broad arc of today. That's what we are doing. I'm going to take a sip of my gallon of water. Weird consequences of Corona. I have not drank out of a glass that is not a mason jar in like maybe 2 months now. Yeah, so because that's what I have in my house, and I don't leave my house. So coffee mugs and mason jars, cheers. All right. So I want to go back to our thought experiment that we had before. So before I asked you, if you were Abraham Lincoln and the war was over, what did you need to be thinking about? Well, that's sort of what I want you to think about now, but I actually want you to think about it from a different perspective. If you were an African American person and the war was over, if it was 1865 and Lee surrendered to Grant and you're facing this new world that slaves have been emancipated and you've got widespread change happening and the war is over, what are the social problems that you need to think about? What are the problems in your life, in your family's life, in your community's life that are the real pressing problems? Because very few people on the ground would have been like, okay, well, Washington needs to do this, this, and this. A remarkable amount of people would have been, and it's one of the things that's interesting about Reconstruction is just how involved people were in national politics. But there are also just other things that need to happen. There are other social problems, and those are the social problems defining people's lives. So pause me for a second and think about what those might be. I'm going to figure out how to add something in here. Okay, note to self. Hi, looking at the recording later, this is where you might get adventurous and put a thing. Or might not. So students watching this, sorry if nothing adventurous happened. Okay, you have a lot of problems because slavery cannot just be stopped. You can, of course, outlaw it, right? But the consequences of slavery are consequences for a broader population that don't just go away. They are still there. And some of those things are political, right? You can say you were a slave, now you are legally a citizen and you are legally free. Although that stuff too would take many years and it would take the passage of several constitutional amendments. We had that conversation. But you doing that doesn't change people's lives very much, right? Slavery as an institution that had existed for several hundred years and had been generationally affecting different families meant that black people simply did not have the tools that they would need for freedom. So it's not like, congratulations, you have citizenship. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you. I would like to run for president now. That doesn't happen. Because of the laws that we've talked about under slavery, black communities were completely ill-equipped to seize the reins of freedom in a way that might have helped that transition. Think about what slavery does. So you know, because we've talked about the fact that it was illegal to teach a slave to read within the institution of slavery. So the vast majority of African Americans do not know how to read. If you don't know how to read, you struggle in this world. You can't vote. You can't read the news. You can't understand your constitutional rights. You can't negotiate labor contracts, right? You can't send personal correspondence. You can't do a lot of the things. Oh, you can't defend yourself in court. So you can't do a lot of the things that people would need to do in order to protect themselves, right? In order to use the law, in order to use their freedom. If you're not literate, that becomes very difficult. Slaves were poor, and this goes almost without saying, but it's worth mentioning. The United States is a capitalist country, right? And as we've discussed in this class, it was very thoroughly capitalist by 1865. Slaves have nothing. They have no, and they're a massive class of people, right? They have no capital. They have no existing capital. They have no way to get land. In many places, it was actually illegal for slaves to own land. They have no marketable skills. They only have agricultural skills. They don't have enough means to move to cities to take up industrial labor, although some of them would be able to. The luckier people would be able to. So they don't have the means to participate in the economy in any way, because they had, for generations, been banned from owning property and been banned from having any real amount of income. So this is a problem, or from getting training, right? So this is a serious problem for the community. They're also facing a lack of skills. So under the institution of slavery, a few black people were trained in specific areas, maybe as cooks, as laundresses, as butlers. If you were super lucky, you were a barber, right? Or you got to work in an industry in a city like Frederick Douglass. But most slaves didn't have that. The vast majority of slaves had no marketable skills other than agricultural skills. And that was a problem for them. But then you also have a couple of other things that are a problem. You have family separation. Most slaves had been sold away from family. They had to create alternate systems of kinship. They were living in marriages that were not formally formalized or legal, because you could not formally or legally get married under slavery. They had children that were therefore not legally their children. So family separation and family legality was a major problem, especially given the fact that if your daughter was sold away from you 13 years ago in a sale in Virginia, how were you going to track that down, right? You don't even know what her name is, according to the new people who bought her, who could just rename her, right? So family separation is really difficult. Family separation is a massive hurdle. And we can't forget to mention the problem of entitled white people. Now, this will be the context of later in the lecture, so I'll spend less time on it. But basically, when the federal government is like, hey, slaves are freed, it's not like all white people are like, wow, you know what? My bad. Slavery, I'm going to take responsibility for that one, and we're going to move on. No, white people don't envision a world where black people count as human. They're really struggling. White people are not able to conceive of a world in which black people are entitled to basic things like literacy and employment and family security. So the fact that white people, many of them are outright hostile. Many of them simply cannot fathom a world where black people should have those things. And that ends up being a very important social problem. And it is, it's as simple as saying racism, but it's much more complex than that in the way that white people felt it and enacted that. Now, the federal government did recognize that this would be a crazy thing to solve, right? And the image that I initially showed you that's on the first slide of this is of the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau, I mentioned briefly last time, it was Lincoln's attempt to fix many of those social problems by putting an organization on the ground that would do a lot of that work. The Freedmen's Bureau was established then in March of 1865, which is just 2 months prior to Lincoln's death. And the organization was at this point, right, when Lincoln created it, funded and massive, and mostly run through civilians, although with military authority in some regards, although that was always vague. And the organization was basically charged with making sure that Black people had what they needed to succeed in a post-war world. We're going to make sure you have basically enough food to survive until we can make this economic transition. We're going to make sure that you have labor, you have contracts, you have work. We're going to make sure that you can get literacy. We're going to make sure you have access to the courts. We're going to make sure that you can find family. Very basic, like, living things, right? This was atrocious to Southerners because it was a large expanse of federal authority. So Democrats argued that the Freedmen's Bureau should never have existed because it was too much federal authority. Johnson fought the Freedmen's Bureau tooth and nail. The Freedmen's Bureau would have had a lot more power and a lot more funding had Abraham Lincoln not died and Andrew Johnson taken his place. However, we do know that the institution left a complicated legacy. So it would survive throughout Reconstruction until the end of Reconstruction, which we will talk about, and it would do a lot of things. But we do know that it often fell short of the needs of freed people, because basically the Freedmen's Bureau saw their task as trying to, don't look at that for a second. The Freedmen's Bureau saw themselves as tasked with trying to make society work after the war, and in that, they often went with to go along is to get along. And that wasn't what Black people needed. So you can see the way that this happens by looking at a few particular instances. For one, Black people needed to find jobs, and they wanted to negotiate labor contracts. They needed employment, and they needed money. And the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to make sure that that happened. But the Freedmen's Bureau is also looking at a South where there are no people to labor in the fields, where the crops are rotting in the fields, where there's no money, where white people desperately need labor. And so what the Freedmen's Bureau does is they push Black people into labor contracts, particularly in the winter of 1865 to 1866, and many of those contracts are not favorable contracts. They're actually really disastrous contracts that are very unfair to Black people, but the Freedmen's Bureau sees part of their job as simply settling things down. Go along to get along, even if it's not great. So in that sense, they didn't live up to what they could fully have done. There were other things. So Black people needed to find families. Many of them wanted to actually leave the South, which is not particularly surprising. But then again, you can see that white people wanted to keep ex-slaves on their land. They wanted Black people to stay in the South so that they had an agricultural force, right? And the Freedmen's Bureau encouraged them to stay because they encouraged that stability. Black people wanted to have access to the courts. They wanted to seek redress. They wanted to hold white people accountable for many of the kinds of violence and discrimination. The Freedmen's Bureau did try to do that, but they were faced with an absolutely monumental task, and it was just simply not possible. So the Freedmen's Bureau varied a lot locally. Like if the local person who worked in the Freedmen's Bureau was a fighter, and they worked really hard for Black people, and they personally believed very much so in the right of Black people to a civic life, the Freedmen's Bureau could be very powerful. It could help people find families. It could help Black people get literacy. A lot of what the Freedmen's Bureau did was establish schools, right? It could negotiate favorable labor contracts. But a lot of the Freedmen's Bureaus didn't work that way. A lot of them were run by lazy people. But even more so, a lot of them simply didn't have the resources. There wasn't enough people to do this job. Think about how immense that job was in the South. So people who worked for the Freedmen's Bureau got wrapped into a derogatory name that Southerners made. So this name is a little bit complicated, and the term itself is important, so I want to spend some time describing it. The term is carpetbaggers. So this is a term that Southerners employed to describe a variety of people that they basically saw as outside meddlers. Here are all of these people from the North coming down to the South to ruin our Southern way of life. They're coming down here and they're instituting policies and they're changing things, and part of that was the administrators of the Freedmen's Bureau. But there were also a wider array of people that came and did that. The KKK called these everybody in the South called these carpetbaggers because supposedly they were people that were opportunists in the North that saw things they could do in the South, put their belongings quickly in a carpet bag, a cheap suitcase, and came to the South. So this cartoon that I have in the background here, I actually want you to pay attention to. So this is a donkey, and the donkey is the representation of the Democratic Party, right? That has on it the KKK, which we'll talk about in a second. And here you have two people, one of whom has a carpet bag, a suitcase, from Ohio. And in the cartoon here, you have the donkey walking out from under the feet of the two people. In other words, the KKK is hanging them, and it wants to hang them because these are bad people that have come to ruin the South. And in a lot of ways, carpetbaggers are confusing because they did a lot of good things, but they also did not do everything that was good for black people. And certainly some of them were opportunists trying to take advantage of the moment. So there were some white people that came down to teach black people how to read, how to write, how to do arithmetic. Like there was a virtual army of white women, sympathetic white women, mostly Christian, from the North that were like, okay, the world needs us. This is our chance. We can do this. Those teachers were dramatically unequipped and unprepared for the world that they would be facing. So they did a lot of good. This is probably the area in which white people did the most good, actually. But those white teachers were not as supported as they could have been. The community schools were often not possible to work with. They often were tasked with impossible things, and they brought down their own rhetoric and lessons as well. So you'd say, okay, this is how you learn, but also, you live in America now and you need to go along to get along, and you need to establish labor contracts because that's the most important thing. So they came with their own rhetoric and set of ideals as well. White people also did something really cool, which is they set up union leagues in the South. And union leagues were supposed to be organizations that encouraged black people to vote and educated them on political matters. And in a lot of places, those union leagues worked very, very well to do that. They did get a significant amount of the black vote out. However, many of those people who ran the union leagues, the white people who ran them, were coming down to the South because they were like, look, I bet I can get elected in a heartbeat. If we just rely on the black vote and I go cultivate the black vote in a specific area, like I could move down from Connecticut into a very heavily populated area by black people, and I could encourage them all to vote, and of course they're going to vote for me. So there were opportunists from the North, and that was something that black people had to navigate. One of the other things that I want to talk about in terms of the unfulfilled promises of carpetbaggers, and I'm going to talk about this more, was this understanding that black people they often viewed these people because they were told that they would get something, right? That black people would get something, but they never did. And that itself was dangerous. That was a dangerous rumor. Let's talk about that 40 acres and a mule thing. So this rumor, the 40 acres and a mule, the phrase, comes from a special order of General William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman had a problem. We're going to go back a little bit. Sherman's problem during the end of the war, especially in his march across the South, was that as he rolled his way through the southern states, he gained camp followers, African-American camp followers. And those camp followers had nothing. They had no food, they had no skills, they had no ability to help the army, but they were literally fleeing for their lives. And Sherman's like, okay, so I can't abandon these people, but I also don't have the food to feed them, and this is a serious problem. So what Sherman decided to do was a really logical thing. And he's like, look, we have all of this land from Confederates, and this Confederate land shouldn't go back to Confederates. They were flipping traitors. So how about this? How about instead I take all of the black people that are camp followers, that have been loyal camp followers to me, and I give them 40 acres, and I rent them out a mule per family. And what this allows them to do is till the land that had lain barren since the war began. They're able to produce crops, and they will be able to care for themselves, and they will be able to, if they work hard, get enough money to purchase that land. So the 40 acres and a mule was the rumor that the federal government would actually give black people the land that it had confiscated from Confederates. And this was a really important rumor because black people were like, yes, that makes a certain amount of sense. Like, that's totally logical. We are the ones that worked on this land forever, and Confederates shouldn't get the land back, and this is a great way to help rebuild the economy of the South. It was such a good idea, in fact, that many other generals were like, yeah, totes, I get that. I'm sure that that will happen. That's definitely something the federal government is going to do. In fact, there were several laws in process in the federal government to get this to happen. But then Lincoln died, and Johnson came into the government, and Johnson gave amnesty to Southerners. And one of the parts of his amnesty was that he gave property back. So there no longer was a pool of land to distribute, because Johnson was adamant that Southerners should be forgiven and given their land back. And the consequence of that was that Black people did not have any land, and they did not have the ability to integrate that way. Many people argued at the time, and people argue historically, that if Black people had been given 40 acres and a mule, they would have been able to acclimate to society much better. They would have been able to deal with the ravages of society because they would have had something. That notion is known as reparations. And reparations would become, it would be a constant factor in discussions of white and Black equality throughout the 20th and even 21st century. But what Black people learned from that rumor, and what they learned from the actions of the Freedmen's Bureau, is that they would need to do a lot of this activism themselves. They could not depend on people from the North to come down and give them things. They could not depend on carpetbaggers to teach them literacy. They couldn't depend on the Freedmen's Bureau to help them navigate jobs. They would need to do this shit on their own. What I want to emphasize before I talk about Black activism is that it's not new. If you remember, we talked about Black activism during slavery. So it's not like all of a sudden the war is over and Black people are like, oh, I could do stuff. No. Actually, they had existing networks already prior to the end of the war, where they had already been cultivating the skills, they had already been cultivating the networks to survive the post-war world. You can see this in the ways that they resisted slavery. So even things as basic as saying, as the ways in which Black people resisted slavery, they could do that to resist the kinds of employment that white people wanted to. Let me give you an example. So let's say that I'm a white employer and I take advantage of my cook, right? I don't want to have myself in here anymore. There's a enslaver who is a sexual abuser and takes advantage of their cook. Maybe the cook decides that suddenly they become a very, very bad cook, so that they do field labor instead, and they labor outside away from that enslaver, right? There are ways that Black people are navigating the institution of slavery like that, and they can continue to navigate their relationships with white people that way after the war is over. So we don't tend to think of that as politics, right? Like we think of voting as politics. But Black people have never had access to the vote at this point in time, and they have learned how to navigate their world to achieve survival at the very bare minimum. And so I want you to think of Black activism not as something that starts in 1865 when the war ends, but something that transforms, because the war offered other opportunities. And many of these things translate fairly directly. So they had already established communities that helped ex-slaves find money and jobs in the North. They had, slaves had already had extensive networks for reuniting families and for maintaining connections between families. They had extensive networks for teaching literacy and creating benevolent organizations. And all of these things existed under slavery. They had a new way to thrive in the post-war period. What I want to explain is that in a lot of ways, freed people had to define what freedom meant for themselves. What does freedom mean? Does it mean the ability to vote? Does it mean the ability to say no to a labor contract? Does it mean the ability to sue somebody in court? And for Black people, these things were dependent on their circumstances, what was very important to them. But I want to emphasize that Black people were not like, it's not like they were granted politics and anybody had to pull their arm. They were like, oh shit, yeah, let's dive into this, right? They did that through any kind of negotiation with their previous owners that they could. Many of them simply left. They were like, the last thing on this planet that I want to do is pick your goddamn cotton. And if that means that I have to pick the cotton of the person 2 doors down, that's the cotton I'm going to pick if that's my only opportunity. But I am not going to do this. So you can see Black people negotiate labor contracts, negotiate individual relationships. They try to find their families. Actually, one of the first things that Black people do is try to find their families. One historian described the post-war period as simply a period of movement when Black people were like, all right, I'm leaving. I know that I don't have money. That's okay. I'm going to go try to find my wife, my daughter, my son. This is the first thing that I'm going to do. And Black churches and Black benevolent organizations really thrived. So in addition to all of the things that we talk about being like traditional voting politics, I want to emphasize that Black people got that haphazardly and they took it whenever they could. But it didn't come to all Black people. It only came to adult Black men. And it was inconsistent. The laws that Southern states put into effect to keep Black people from voting were significant. And so it was not the only kind of activism that Black people had. In fact, a lot of this activism was very loud and very visible. And so you see things like a 4th of July celebration, and Black people had their own 4th of July celebration alongside the white celebration that wouldn't include them, right? When there is segregation, Black people decide to throw their own parties. And so a lot of this is very visible. Take, for instance, Juneteenth. So in June of 1867, someone's going to fact check me on that one, pretty sure. Anyway, it was 2 years after the actual Emancipation Proclamation, and 2 years after the end of the war, 2 years after slavery. Anyway, it was a long time after slavery was actually outlawed, right? But in Galveston, Texas, see what I did there? Bringing the story home. In Galveston, Texas, that news was suppressed. White people did not want slaves to know that slavery was over. And the Confederacy held Galveston after a long and protracted battle for the port. And they didn't want the slaves to know that the North had won, because that would profoundly alter their world. And Black people would stop working, and Black people would know that they were free. When the news of emancipation finally reached Galveston, it was considered to be one of the last places in the nation that heard about it. And Black citizens in Galveston were obviously ecstatic and threw a large party. That Juneteenth party came to be celebrated as a kind of alternate July 4th celebration among Black people, as the celebration of complete emancipation of the nation. And a lot of these things were crazy visible. And they said, the most offensive things to white Americans were to say, we hold this legacy too. We hold the legacy of the Declaration of Independence. This is our independence. We hold the legacy of the revolution. This is our revolution. And Black people claimed that narrative. And by taking public space and by being visible, they essentially said, dude, we're American. Get over it. Even when Black people did not have access to full political participation, they did it anyway. So I mentioned these very briefly, but when Johnson came to be president, he instituted constitutional conventions in the states, and those constitutional conventions did not allow Black people to participate. Black people held their own, which is like phenomenally interesting. They're just like, well, fuck it, we're going to make our own. We know that they're not going to count. We know that they're not going to be the one that actually is respected by Washington, but we want to demonstrate that we can be part of politics to challenge Johnson's presidency. So you see a lot of this kind of stuff, right? Black people are functioning in this in-between space between being able to have full civic participation and being cut out of that civic participation. And they're doing crazy things like throwing parades and voting and establishing networks. And basically, they're profoundly changing the world. So imagine that you are an ex-Confederate. Imagine that it's 1868. This has been going on for a few years. Black people are highly active. They have gotten, by this time, like strong church organizations. They have voted in an election. Things are really remarkably different in the South. The question I want to ask you is, how do you feel about this? Now, in one sense, the answer is obvious, but take a second to actually think through those emotions and try to describe for me what you think the primary emotion would be. One of the primary emotions that I want to emphasize is fear. If you are a white person and you see the world shifting underneath your feet, the structure and order of society as you had always known it is suddenly gone. It's the equivalent of imagining, I'm going to make a racist comparison because that's how the people in the South would have thought about it, so forewarn. Imagine all of a sudden, tomorrow, children were granted the right to vote. White people in the South thought that black people being given the right to vote was as ridiculous as we would think that that is now, right? Because they thought of black people as incapable citizens. So they were petrified. They were petrified that black people had the ability to make decisions, that they had the ability to walk down the street unmolested, that they had the ability to make their own income and participate in politics. White people were flipping terrified. Here is this race of people that we have systematically oppressed for 2 centuries, and all of a sudden they're free. Oh shit, right? White people were so scared of black people that rumors circulated, completely unfounded. Rumors circulated that black people were going to rise up and kill all white people in the winter of 1865. This literally never happened. Never happened. Never happened. Never, 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 never happened. So the Christmas insurrection of 1865 was an insurrection that never happened. White people were absolutely convinced that in 1865, which is a moment that tensions were incredibly high, because this was the winter after the war was over, and it was a winter when white people very much so needed black people to go back to work, and they were not going back to work because they could not, and it was the first time they could exercise that right. And so white people circulated a rumor that black people were going to rise up in mass and attack them and kill all of the white people. This was not true. This was scared white people, angry at black political participation, angry at black freedom, and essentially, because they were so scared of black violence, they preemptively attacked black people. The Christmas insurrection scare was never an insurrection of black people. It was actually an attack of white people on black people that were perfectly innocent, that they expected would become violent. And it's one of the ways I think that we can see how tense the situation was and how ready to be violent white people were. Throughout the course of Reconstruction, so we talk about Reconstruction as this attempt by Washington and by people on the ground to reconstruct the nation in a way that black people participated in it. White people engaged in their own version of post-war politics, and that version was redemption. The efforts to reinstate a world where white people were in control. The efforts to recreate the pre-war circumstances. That effort is known as redemption. Southerners framed this as the effort to redeem the South from the ravages of the Civil War, from the changes of the Civil War. And white people worked really hard and worked really creatively to do everything that they could to prevent black people from having civic participation. This is really important right now, so I just want to show you my dog. Murphy. Murphy, are you dreaming? Yeah, he's passed out, sorry. Okay, so now let's do another thought experiment. Think about yourself as a white Southerner who is terrified and angry at the effects of Reconstruction. What are you going to do about it? Well, it turns out that white people were remarkably creative. In fact, this is true of all of American history. This is a general truth. White people have been amazingly creative in the ways that they have forcibly encouraged black people to stay in their proper social place. Racism is an active process. It is not a passive process. One of the things, the most important thing that white Southerners could do and thought that was their right was to force freed people to go back to work. Now, this is happening in the context of, okay, so you've got an agriculturally devastated South, right, that does not have the means for survival. You have a cotton crop that needs to be picked by the winter of 1865. And you have black people that don't want to go back to work, because why would you want to go back to work for the person that had just enslaved you for years? When they're saying, I guess I'll pay you food and clothing and shelter. That's exactly what slavery was. So a lot of black people are like, I don't want this. And in the context of that, white people are petrified that their crops are going to rot. And they're like, no, I have a right to black labor, damn it. And so one of the things that they tried to do was to force black people to work. Unfortunately for black people, this was very successful, partially because of the black codes, which we're going to look at together, and partially because of the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau also really encouraged them to take those contracts. And the Freedmen's Bureau would say things like, look, the Christmas insurrection scare, the violence that white people are enacting against you is because you're not working. Just work, and that violence will go away. That's absolutely not true. More importantly, many of the contracts that black people signed, and here you go. This is a historical photo of a dog. You're welcome for that. The rest of the photo is awful. Ignore this guy, but the dog. Oh, wait, here's dog number 2. I never noticed there were 2 dogs in it. Wait, do you think he moved from here, or this was another one? And then maybe another one? And then look at this one. Okay, this is not important, sorry. Okay, the important part of this is that these contracts were incredibly exploitative. And the exploitative contracts after slavery began the process that is known as sharecropping, or the practice known as sharecropping. Sharecropping was a kind of labor that was paid, not paid labor. In a sharecropping system, black people would work for white people on a plantation. And on that plantation, they would get a certain amount of land, and that land would not belong to the black people. They would lease that land. And for leasing that land, they would harvest the crop on that land, plant and harvest the crop on that land. And the price of leasing the land was something like 2/3 of the product of that crop. And with the rest of it, they could survive. They could buy food and clothing and tools and implements. In an ideal world, they could do this and get ahead year after year as their crop improved. But that never happened. And it didn't happen for a couple of reasons. One, white people always demanded more. 2, this actually put the onus on black people to do the work of selling the crop, which they had never done before, and they did not get fair prices for it. 3, am I on 3? The places that black people had to buy clothing and housing and tools were all under the purveyance of the white person that they were also working for. And obviously were not fair, right? So you could say, all right, I've had this many slaves for a long time, and now I'm going to charge them for the clothes that I would have given them, and the food and the clothing. And oh, look, it happens to be the surplus of crops, and actually a little more you owe me. So black people were kept in perpetual debt as tenants under sharecropping. This is really, really critical because, okay, so before you were working for Joe Schmo and you picked his cotton and you watched his kids and you lived on his farm and how is this any flipping different? It's slavery by another name. And the important thing about sharecropping is that it didn't require the legal basis of slavery. It just required the economic basis of poverty. Now, many white people were also sharecroppers, but slavery created certain traumas for black people, especially when you were working for the same white people that you had been working for under slavery, which was fairly common. You could use violence to control free people. You know what? This is actually a good place to talk about. So why would black people accept these contracts? Well, there were a couple of reasons, but one of the things that I wanted you to look at today were the Mississippi Black Codes. Now, I'll talk more about black codes in general in a couple of slides, but one of the things of black codes that was important was that white people used them to prevent black people from getting and negotiating jobs. So, for instance, this is a vagrancy law. Many of the black codes were vagrancy laws, and the vagrancy laws said, if you don't have this kind of employment, you can be fined. So take a look here. So black people over the age of 18 that have no lawful employment, so anybody who does not have a labor contract in hand, and that's how they defined this, right? Like you have to have the actual labor contract in your hand at all times, or on you at all times. Or any black people found assembling themselves together, and any white people that assembled with them, or anybody who was living in an interracial marriage, or anybody basically who was doing any of these things could be called a vagrant. And a vagrant can be fined an excessive amount of money. And a vagrant, after being fined an excessive amount of money, now you may not think that this is an excessive amount of money, but it was in the 19th century. It was in a world where black people had no money. They could be fined. And if they could not pay the fine, then the court can hire them out to anybody who will pay for them. So if they can't pay the fine, then they would be imprisoned. And as imprisoned, they would be hired out to people who would pay their fine for them. So basically, if you refused employment from your employer, so, okay, let me think about it this way. So if you refused employment from the person who had previously enslaved you, you were like, I don't want to take that contract, I don't want to be your slave, then you didn't have employment. And your employer could call the sheriff, and the sheriff would be like, do you have employment? And you would be like, no. And they'd be like, we can arrest you for that. You now have a $200 fine. And the black person would be like, well, I can't pay that fine. And the court would be like, okay, well, then you are arrested, and we're going to lease you out to somebody, and the former owner will lease you out for cheaper than they would have originally hired you for, and you don't get the money. So this was a way to keep black people in jobs forcibly. You can see this because most punishments for black people were labor, were various kinds of labor. This is a provision that says that black people cannot own land, and they cannot lease land, except in cities when ultimately other authorities have jurisdiction. This is an interesting one, too. Every civil officer will, and every person can, arrest and carry back any black person who runs away from their legal employer. In other words, if you quit the job that you were forced to sign up for, you can be forcibly carried back, and the person that carries you back will actually get money. So there's a lot in here. Maybe I'll be able to get back to it later in the conversation. But a lot of this centers around the fact that so-called vagrants are hired out. You could also use violence. If you were a white person who wanted to get black people to labor and to not vote and to shut up and pick cotton, you could use violence to make sure that that happened. Now, if you remember, when we talked about Johnson, and this is a really good place to see the bottom up and top down, we talked about how Johnson basically allowed the KKK to flourish by not checking them. And he allowed them to flourish by allowing states in the South to reinstitute their state militias, which were often Klan members. And the Klan, which was born in this period out of the remnants of the ex-Confederate Army, was very violent against black people and used to control them. So they would do things like, oh, you voted in the last election? Well, suddenly, your crops are burnt down. Or you refused to sign a contract with your employer? Well, we've killed your daughter, and we may kill your son if you don't sign that contract. The KKK is a terrorist organization because they used violence and terror selectively to control what freed people did. And the KKK was immensely powerful. They targeted homes, churches, schools, anywhere where black people were politically active. And one of the things that we know about the KKK is that there were three major insurgencies of the KKK, three major wings of it, and all of those coincide with moments in American history when black people had gotten a significant amount of power. So the KKK thrives in the immediate post-war period. They also thrive in the 1920s as a response to the gains that black people had made during World War I. They also thrive in the 1950s as a response to Black civil activism and the gains that Black people had made. So why is this just not illegal and people just take care of it because this is not legal? Well, because what's legal is confusing in the post-war South, and who has the jurisdiction to determine legality is even more confusing. So why I gave you one of these sources about the KKK in Texas, and this is a Union general who is trying to maintain order and who basically says, it's impossible. It's impossible to maintain order here, and this is by 1868. This is a primary source because it's 1868, right? He's writing to the federal government and saying that this organization is getting increasingly strong and increasingly cohesive, and what they mean to do is to simply kill Union officers and Black people because it is beneficial for them to do so, to intimidate anybody who helps Black people and will not be part of the KKK. I want to mention one thing. These political meetings, barbecues, are not actual barbecues. Barbecue is the term that many people are using to describe a public lynching, which is called a barbecue because the person being lynched is often burned as well. So what General Reynolds is saying here is that it is absolutely impossible to keep track of what's happening. It's absolutely impossible to hold people accountable because this is an utter land of lawlessness. It's not going to get any better until there's much more federal authority and federal enforcement. And even then, it's going to have to be very careful federal enforcement because rooting out a terrorist organization is not easy, right? And simply put, the Union Army in the moment of occupation did not have the means to do that. It is worth saying that Ulysses S. Grant would be the most forceful president against the KKK, and he would pass a series of enforcement acts that were meant to hold the KKK accountable. And they did do this. They helped to, the KKK functioned very openly in the immediate post-war period, and the enforcement acts forced them to go underground. It didn't get rid of them, but it did make it illegal to be part of them. The other thing that you could do that was very important is if you were a white person, you could bend the law and change the law to prevent Black people from voting, from getting good jobs, to participating in politics. One of these things is the vagrancy laws that I already talked about, right? But there are a lot of other laws as well. Let's go back to the Mississippi Code. One of the things that I think is most important about this document is basically this law says any laws that existed during slavery about what Black people can and cannot do exist now. So basically, again, it's not going to be slavery, but we're going to make a lot of laws that say, well, Black people have to be employed. Black people cannot own property. Black people cannot own firearms and weapons to protect themselves, which is here, right? Black people cannot marry white people. Black people cannot assemble. Black people cannot, basically, you could use the law to circumscribe Black people's lives. And while the federal government said no slavery, the federal government never explicitly prohibited these things. Many of these things do violate the constitutional amendment that says Black people count as citizens with all of the rights and privileges thereof. But changing that would require suing and going through a federal court, and that took time. It was the entire reason that the NAACP was born, was to do that kind of work. So until then, states fought tooth and nail for the kinds of laws that they could make to circumscribe Black people's lives. An important component of that were literacy tests. Literacy tests basically said you were not allowed to vote if you were illiterate. The hypothetical justification being that you shouldn't vote if you're not literate because you don't know what's going on. The problem, of course, was that white people had been voting for a very long time when they were illiterate, and Black people were almost universally illiterate. And literacy tests were not administered the same to Black and white people. So a literacy test for a white person might say, hey, why don't you recite the Pledge of Allegiance? And then a literacy test for a black person would be calculus, because black people are not given the same ones, and they are graded, interpreted by white people who don't necessarily want to have black people vote, right? Or you could simply show up and say, I'm gonna shoot you if you vote. So there were a lot of ways to prevent black people from voting, and the 15th Amendment, which is the one that said that black people should get to vote, was immensely vague on what states can and cannot do. It was very simple. It said you cannot be prevented from voting based on race or previous condition of servitude. However, it did not say things like, well, you can't have a literacy test, or you can't have a poll tax, or you can't physically threaten someone at the polls. There were a lot of ways that Southerners got around this. You could say, for instance, you can't vote if your grandfather was a slave. If we can prove that your grandfather was a slave, you're not permitted to vote. How is that not, like, that just does not allow black people to vote. And Southerners could get away with that because it wasn't technically a violation of the 15th Amendment. Hello, good morning, my little girl. Good morning, did you wake up? You waking up your brother? Oh, you're taking his bone. You good stretch. Yeah, good girl. Okay, bye. Yeah, you're just going to take that and go away? Okay. All right, I love you. No, you're back? Okay. This is very important. Okay. That was very loud. You have to be quiet. We're being serious now. The last thing that you could do, and the last thing I want to talk about, is you could put a sympathetic president in office. So over the course of a couple of years after the war, white people were able to gain significant control of politics, significant amount of control over politics that they were able to negate the black vote by 1876. In 1876, there's a presidential election, and that election is incredibly contested. So Republicans run Rutherford B. Hayes. Ulysses S. Grant was very controversial. There was no law in place saying that he couldn't serve more than 2 terms, but he was a really controversial figure because of how much he did to help black people, and also because his administration was fairly corrupt, economically speaking, in the North. And so Grant was not universally popular. And so Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, who was much more moderate. He was like, we're going to do Reconstruction, but we're going to be less aggressive about it. Democrats nominated this guy named Samuel J. Tilden, and Samuel J. Tilden basically said the South will rise again. Like, we need to reassert Southern control. We need to get rid of Reconstruction entirely. And so this was basically the election of 1860 over again, right? Like, this is the Northerners versus the Southerners. How is this any different than the war? Things were incredibly tense. To make things worse, the vote was very close. Technically, Samuel Tilden won-ish, but there were a lot of votes that weren't accounted for, and those votes would have made Hayes win. And people argued about the validity of that vote because Democrats were literally holding guns to black people's heads so that they could not vote. So Republicans were like, look, if you didn't do that, we would clearly have a Republican victory. And Democrats were like, yeah, we did that, but we have a right to do that because it's not unconstitutional. So basically, what you get in this election is one in which nobody knows who won because nobody knew what legal voting would look like. In order to fix this, it's hard for me to overstate what was happening here. This was an election that was North versus South again. This was so tense that actually Ulysses S. Grant was like, hey, let's not disband the military yet. Like, actually, why don't we gather troops in Washington, D.C., so that if something happens, we've just got a standing army here. Like there was troop buildup in the North and in the South. People thought war was going to happen again. In 1877, an informal compromise was reached between Republicans and Democrats in order to barely prevent war. So you see this sign here. Democrats have their hand on a gun and on a sign that says Tilden or blood. And Republicans say, wait, no, we can work out some sort of an arrangement. And the arrangement that they work out is this. They say, okay, Republicans will win the election, and that moderate Republican, Hayes, will get into office. It's not going to be a radical Republican. He's going to be a moderate, and he will be the one that wins. But Democrats will get what they want. and the North will pull out of the South and end formal Reconstruction. This was the dirty deal that prevented the Civil War from breaking out again. The Compromise of 1877 is generally regarded as the end of Reconstruction in the South. It's the end of radical policies that changed Black life. It's when the federal government was basically like, all right, Black people, you gotta figure it out from here, because Democrats were so violent that they forced their hand on that. So what are we left with? Well, the 19th century leaves us with a lot. In terms of civil rights, we can call this the unfinished revolution. You have a lot of things that indicate that Southern life as it was would not survive. Southern identity, the way of Southern life, was basically put to the test, and it lost. The Civil War was a contest of various visions for the future, and the South unequivocally lost. But they became martyrs in that regard. Southerners called it a lost cause. They called it the Grand Old South. They memorialized that past. And that became a really powerful ideology. On the one hand, Black people got significant constitutional rights, awesome rights through the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. But those rights were not coherent enough that individual state laws could not deny them. Voting's a really great example of that. And you also have a really wonderful legacy that is built here of civil rights activism, of Black activism, of a recognition of what Black people would need, of a promise that if the federal government is actually committed to equality, it can make it happen. But then you also have another legacy that's born, is the response legacy to that. It's a legacy of the KKK. It's a legacy of violence. It's a legacy of political oppression, and it's a legacy of ongoing fighting. So in one sense, this may sound a little bit dramatic, and it doesn't exactly give credit to the people that died, but you can see the Civil War as a war ends in 1865. But as a political battle, as an ongoing violent war between white people and Black people, it doesn't end. The Civil War ends in the formal, we will march our army against your army sense. But really what the Civil War did was it just defined the new fault lines for the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. But if you want to examine where those fault lines head, you need to take History 106. So that's what I have got for you today, and that's what I've got for you for this class. I will see you for our last session, which we will have live on Zoom. Have a nice day, folks.